How do we get to that point where Asia has all those desirable features of a developed country, the infrastructure, the institutions, the lifestyle, the consumable elements that we like, but how do we get there without challenging the environment and those externalities that the West took for granted?
Right. Well, let's remember that at some level, we're already past that question. You're not asking a future hypothetical. You're asking a question that we should have been dealing with 25 years ago, because the accumulated emissions in the atmosphere from almost not pre-Chinese growth, but certainly pre-massive emissions outputting China,
but that's the
were
ultimate
already
question.
Dangerous enough, let alone China today and India today. Most recent measurements suggest that China is responsible for 25% of global emissions more than the United States.
China aside for a moment, I mean, we still have an enormous number of countries in Asia, the Asian continent, not just Southeast Asia where we are, but all the STAN states, if you like, all of which are sitting in a position where they're going, well, we would like those desirable infrastructures and institutions. And the global situation that you just highlighted is not something that they can take into account without damaging their prospects.
Correct. And this is why I'm glad when you asked the question sort of, can Asia develop? And what I want to emphasize is that you are rightly asking about what I call the fourth wave Asian economies. So not China, which is already very modern, not Japan, not the tiger economy, certainly not Taiwan, South Korea, not the first world part of Asia. The majority of Asia has, as you rightly imply, yet to develop, right? And there we're talking about South and Southeast Asia. So the population from Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, so South Asia, that's more than 1.5 billion people. And then Southeast Asia, so 750 million people. So you're looking at 2.5 billion people, most of whom are still quite underdeveloped. And urbanization is happening very quickly. Economic growth is happening quickly. Consumption is rising.
Better.
Yeah. So the question is for them. So what we're really talking about is the next 2 billion Asian consumers and citizens, right? How do they urbanize? How do they consume? And can that be done in a more sustainable way? The answer, both in theory and practice, is yes. The challenge is scale, right? So how do you do the right things that are being done in some places at a much vaster, almost universal scale across these, say, 12, 15 countries?
Well, for the sake of simplicity, can I break it down into two parts? I mean, you say the answer is yes, but let's look at it from the consumer perspective and the governmental perspective, because the answer is yes insofar as we have the capacity. But what about the policy-making side? And what about that tension between those governments who want to deliver the results that we're talking about as quickly as possible and effectively as possible, and the stress that puts on the sustainable development goals and the way we're thinking in terms of the planetary boundaries?
But even within fourth wave Asia, you can't really generalize about the caliber, the capacity, the vision of the governments, right? So that's the thing about Asia and its discrepancies and its degree of inequality. If ASEAN, just ASEAN, were a country of 600 plus million people, it would be by far the world's most unequal country. You would have Myanmar and East Timor on the one hand, and you would have Brunei and Singapore on the other. So global inequality is a fiction compared to what it is in this part of the world. And similarly with government capacity, we can't really refer to Asian governments having similar desires and capacities to achieve sustainable growth because they don't, right? Some don't really even acknowledge, the sort of challenges ahead because in any case, rhetorically, they may still be focused on this sort of north-south divide. What I think it really comes down to is technology transfer, an affordable technology transfer. I would quite frankly replace a lot of the climate summitry, with private jets flying to Bali and Copenhagen and Cancun and whatnot. I would really replace it with a lot more technology transfer. Let's remember that within Asia, if you think about the innovations in Japan and in China, everything from hydrogen power to solar power and so forth, wind as well. And the cost the cost parameters there have come down so rapidly. And then innovations in poorer countries, in India, for example, where they're doing so much with biomass energy and so forth. If you focused a lot more on transferring the best practices out of China and India and Japan into the poorer countries and subsidizing their achievement of their energy objectives, their electrification goals, their industrial goals, but doing so in a sustainable way, then there would not be a contradiction between those countries having job creation, electricity supply, better education, the goals that they have, healthcare, and the environment.
Let's talk about technology transfer in just a second.
Yep.
Because the whole point of these conversations that we're having on TFI is to facilitate that transfer and to encourage that transfer to the ends that we're talking about. But before we get to that, let me just talk about that policy-making thing still. Yes, governments are different. Yes, they have utterly different ways of doing things, and the diversity is bewildering. But having said that, again, when we talk about planetary boundaries, there's going to have to be some kind of rapid alignment towards some sort of commonality in purpose and practical execution, isn't there? How do we make that happen? How can we, before we achieve the transfer of technology, how do we achieve the transfer, the meme, if you like, of sustainability into policymaking?
I'll be honest with you, I don't believe that local actors or regional governments and countries should be waiting for a grand binding, Paris plus kind of consensus before they act.
Is it too utopian to think that perhaps we should be pressuring them to do so?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think that, again, countries of Southeast Asia or India need to wait for whether or not the United States or Russia or Canada sign on to the Paris Climate Agreement or to actually make good on their promises to do something for themselves. That would be ridiculous because global governance doesn't really work that way. It's not really, it doesn't live up to, in reality, what it purports to be on paper. At this point in time, remember, who is most negatively impacted, right? It's Asian countries themselves.
Sure.
So to think that they need to wait for Moscow and Ottawa and Washington and London to show diplomatic willpower before they act in their own interest is utterly ridiculous. I can't imagine a perpetuation of a kind of slavish colonial mentality than that.
So if we have, as you say, such a diversity of governance systems, attitudes, behaviors,
right,
how do we ensure, given the planetary boundaries, that we can make sure that the technology transfer actually takes hold in the way that it should? Can technology transfer, let me simplify it, can necessary technology transfer occur in an environment without proper policy support?
Yes, it's happening all the time. That's where markets come in, right? And they've been critical for this because you have market opening and privatization and trade liberalization happening irrespective of whether or not you have a binding Paris, sort of a climate agreement. So in the absence of even a global normative framework, even in the absence of global binding regulation, again, none of which are ever really going to happen, you still have markets, sort of positively impacting the tech transfer environment because the cost of these technologies has come down. Now, individual governments are also obviously incentivizing.
But is it fast enough? I mean, okay,
well,
so I'll concede that it's
yeah.
happening, but is it happening at a pace that we should? Because we see what's happened post-Paris and all the other COP meetings that have subsequently followed. We're not keeping up to the standards that we pledged to
again,
and understand.
My entire point being that I would roll back the clock 15, 20 years, and instead of all of these COP summits, I would have focused on tech transfer rather than asking whether or not we are now versus next year, the year after, are we doing enough to have met targets that should have been set much earlier? I think that's just the wrong approach to the issue.
Okay, let's talk about that.
We should have been doing technology all along.
How does the tech transfer work? I mean, tell me your experiences and how it's been occurring in an Asian context thus far.
Right.
And whether it's been optimal or how can we make it optimal?
Yeah. So first is just in hydrocarbon markets, right? Just the gas transition is finally accelerating in Asia, right? This is still obviously the region that consumes the most fossil fuels and imports the most from West Asia, from the Arab Persian Gulf countries. countries. But at the same time, you finally have regional gas markets. So you have a lot of infrastructure investment in gas, technology and so forth. So that's one critical thing. And that means itself, obviously, just less emissions generation there, while also, of course, critically providing the energy for populations to develop and modernize, urbanize, and so on. Then if you look at solar, obviously, because of what China has done in terms of the subsidies given to that market, on the one hand, it's been anti-competitive from the perspective of Western companies in that field. On the other hand, it's massively brought down the cost of solar. So you see a huge increase in many Asian countries, if not most, that have very large-scale solar projects now, provided they have the right climate, sort of conditions. So from Mongolia to India, everywhere, you have solar as a key feature of rural electrification now everywhere because the cost has come down. If I'm not mistaken, Bangladesh has the highest rate of portable solar rural electrification in the world, right? So that's another example of this kind of technology. And you see more and more of that happening. Again, not because Paris happened, because it didn't really happen.
But
right?
again, you see more and more of it, but it's in discrete, small-scale units.
Right.
Is it enough for what we're doing? And how can we make sure that transfer becomes the dominant mode of thinking as opposed to just a fill-in for the other parts?
Well, the first answer to your question has to be a much more honest and brutally honest kind of appraisal of where we are in terms of the planetary balance, which if it is as precarious as, we're led to believe, and we shouldn't necessarily doubt it, or if anything, we should apply the precautionary principle and overcompensate at times like this, we would need to do a lot more than simply distributing lots of solar panels, given where we are with sea level rise and glacial melt and so forth. So
this being part of the whole point of these conversations.
We're at the phase now where we need to be talking about serious geoengineering. I mean, if you want to be having a serious conversation encompassing all issues, you would be saying, I really hope that there's some major geoengineering project that's being cooked up Manhattan Project style, in secret, and that it's already being deployed.